Welcome, everybody, to the HTH Church podcast. My name is Toby. I'm the curate here, if you don't know me, based at Holy Trinity Church in Hastings. And today, we're going to be having a bit of a conversation around Colossians, which is the series we've been looking at on Sundays. And I'm joined by a very special guest, one Jason Myers, who is coming all the way from across the pond in the States. Jason, welcome to the HTH Church podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for giving up your time today to come and talk to us about this.
You're welcome.
Jason, I wonder if we could start. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself. Why have I got you, of all people, here? What do you do? Who are you? What are you about? And how did you end up doing what you do as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you mentioned, my name's Dr. Jason Myers, and I am currently based in North Carolina, where I teach biblical studies as an associate professor of religion at Greensboro College. We came in contact through a mutual friend because I also teach at WTC Theology in Nottingham. And so I come over twice a year to teach biblical studies classes for them. And so we've kind of connected through our friend Becky, and she has put us in touch. So I am currently working on a Colossians commentary for a new series called Proclamation, Preaching the New Testament, which is aimed at how we preach these texts in our church settings. And so I'm busy at work. I think I've made it through chapter 1. And I love studying the Apostle Paul. That's what I did my PhD in. And so I've been studying Paul for the last, 15 years or so. Math can be hard sometimes. But I love the Apostle Paul because I find him to be such an interesting figure, sometimes infamous at best. But I think he has, a unique placement for our day and age, and how he conceives of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and how he works in settings where persons have come to know the story of the gospel from no kind of theological background. So I find him to be a great aid in that.
You mentioned a little bit about Paul there, why he's significant for you. And why do you think he's important to us today? Why should we pay attention to someone who was writing these letters 2,000 years ago? And also, this is the thing I love about Paul anyway, myself, is just that he was writing these letters with no idea that 2,000 years later we'd be sat down having a conversation about something that he wrote. So why do we do that? Why are we paying attention to him?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we should never miss the big surprise here that we are studying letters from 2,000 years ago. That might strike Paul as interesting, to say the least. But I think, he is someone for the moment that we find ourselves in. As I mentioned a little bit ago, right? He primarily works with Gentiles, persons who do not have a Jewish background. They have not been reading the Old Testament or the Ten Commandments. They don't know about the prophets. And I really see Paul as kind of a cross-cultural communicator. In a way, that's what he's doing. He's taking this very Jewish message about Israel's God, about Yahweh, and kind of translating it into a key that non-Jewish people can understand. And I think this is partially related to who he is as a person. If you remember, Paul grew up in the city of Tarsus, which is located in modern-day Turkey. And so he kind of stands with kind of one foot in that Gentile world, but of course is raised as a Jewish person, training to be a Pharisee, so a foot in a very different world. And I think from the moment he began to put concepts together as a young kind of lad, I think he was beginning to do this kind of translation work of how does this story about Israel's God make sense in a world that looks so radically different from his own? If you're involved in ministry or just life in this world, you probably have found yourself at that intersection before. How do these stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, about Jesus and the disciples, about Paul and these communities, how do they make sense in a world that looks so radically different from our own? And so I think there's a lot we can learn from Paul about how to do that, and about how this message really does transform our world that we see ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was is it Willie James Jennings who talks about the reminder that we today are all Gentiles. And we're so far removed from that. So Paul is a really helpful conversation partner for us. Like can feel so far removed from the Judaism of Paul's day and the Judaism today and all those kind of things. So he's great to be in dialogue with.
Exactly.
You mentioned that you've embarked on this commentary on the study of Colossians. Why Colossians out of all the books? I mean, most people would maybe go for Romans or Galatians, but you've gone for Colossians. What is it that you love about it? Maybe.
So yeah, I am also a co-editor of the series, and so we gave away Romans and Galatians to maybe some of the more higher ups, the more senior level persons. I am still relatively young, and so I took up Colossians. It's actually been a favorite letter of mine for a long time. Kind of in personal backstory, one of the first classes I ever took in biblical studies was on Colossians, and so in many ways it is rather fitting that the first time I embarked on a study of Paul was in Colossians and Philemon, and now here I am writing a commentary. So there's a kind of a niceness to that I'm really really happy to. I think Colossians is important in a way that I've termed somewhat creatively as a theology for the valley. And I mean this in a couple of different ways. Of course, Paul is currently writing from prison. He is imprisoned because of his testimony about Jesus being Lord. And so he finds himself in that kind of metaphorical valley. Colossae, the city itself, is actually located literally in the Lycus Valley, which is in modern day Turkey. And so literally they find themselves located in that, not just in a literal sense, but also I think in a figurative sense. As you read through the letter, right, Paul is encouraging them, challenging them, as they are kind of beset and maybe beleaguered by a few other issues going around in their day. And so I think Paul writes this as a theology for the valley to kind of lift their eyes in many ways from where they're at to this vision that you see in chapter 1 of this kind of cosmic Christ, of the Christ that rules and sustains all, who has been there since creation, and has, called them into relationship with himself. And so I think it's this theology for the valley.
That's good. He lifts their eyes. That's great. That's really helpful. And so, what was the kind of particular occasion? Why was Paul writing to this community of people? And what was some of perhaps the issues they were facing? What were some of the things they were looking down on that they needed to lift their eyes to this, like you said, this kind of image of the cosmic Christ that we read about in Colossians 1?
Yeah, this is one of those points in scholarship, we say this all the time, where there's disagreement. There's a variety of opinions, which is not hard to find when you come across studying scripture. But it is actually rather challenging because when we study Paul's letters, right, we have kind of one side of that telephone call or that cell phone call. And so sometimes we try to piece together maybe what's happening in a particular location. One of the things that makes it challenging with Colossae is that Paul didn't start this church. We realize from the letter that Epaphras, who's mentioned there in chapter 1 and chapter 4, he's Paul's co-worker, and he's kind of integral to these communities that are in this valley. There's kind of a triad of cities that are kind of growing up together. And so when we read through the letter, we try to find places where it may give evidence of what's been going on. And one of those pieces is what I've already mentioned, chapter 1. There's something about this hymn that seems to be related to some of the problems in the letter. And so we get this kind of cosmic vision. But as we read through the letter, a couple of different issues have been put forward. Some see it just as pagan religion. So again, as I mentioned, all these Gentiles kind of come out of non-Jewish ways of life. And so it may be related just to pagan conceptions of God. Some have looked at philosophy. Some have looked at issues dealing with Judaism, maybe a little bit like Galatians. And then some say it might be a kind of collection or constellation of issues that have prompted Paul to write. As you read through the letter, I kind of orient your listeners to a couple different sections. So in chapter 2, we get this big discussion in verse 8, where Paul says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy or elemental spiritual forces." And in verse 16, there's this idea of eating and drinking and festivals and Sabbaths. And then in verse 20 through 21 of chapter 2, we get these spiritual forces again about do not handle do not taste, do not touch. And so it appears to be some sort of combination, I think, of a variety of issues confronting this church that Paul has to kind of remind them of these realities.
Mm. Could you just speak a little bit more about those different things, Colossians 2:8-18 and 20-21? It's quite hard to understand what Paul is really getting at with those things. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, those elements, what makes it difficult is that we can't all put them kind of in one box. So again, the idea of Sabbath day. Okay, well, Sabbath is observed, right, by people involved in Judaism. So we go, okay, it must be a Jewish related issue. But then we get issues of like new moons, deceptive philosophies, things like that. And we go, well, maybe this is related to some sort of philosophical tradition. And we do know a lot of different groups, even Jewish groups like Philo down in Alexandria, Egypt, that attempted to engage with various forms of philosophy in the first century. And so it appears to, I think, be some sort of amalgamation of various factions where the Colossians have kind of slipped back into different ways of life. And Paul's kind of calling them, again, out of that valley in a way. To this kind of freedom in Christ, to the importance of Christ. And again, we get this issue of eating and drinking, which comes up a lot in Paul's letters, whether you're in Romans 12-15, 1 Corinthians. And so it seems to be issues that kind of beset new congregants, new people who came to know Jesus, and highly related to those kind of past avenues of their life.
And those things are issues because they fracture the community in some way. Is that am I right with that?
Yeah, there appears to be some sort of division here within the community where they are, maybe seeking to separate from one another, which we see a lot in some of Paul's other letters. And that's what we do as scholars is we try to kind of, look at the region, look at Paul's other letters and see if there's, again, Paul may just have known about the region. It's not terribly far from Galatia. And so it may have been kind of in that orbit. And so as he writes, he kind of writes in that vein. I believe it was Michael Bird who said, Colossians is like if Galatians and Ephesians had a baby. And so it's this kind of interesting, creative letter here that has touchstones with Galatians, but then a few with Ephesians as well.
Yeah. Okay, and you touched on it a little bit just now, but the solution to the issues that the Colossians are facing, these things that are breaking or wanting them to separate in some way, Paul's solution is quite simple: it's Jesus. But I guess Colossians, you mentioned the hymn, which is the reference to the bit in chapter 1 where you get all this beautiful poetic imagery. Can you unpack that a little bit more? Paul's solution there to these issues.
Yeah, so we get this hymn in Colossians 1:15-20, which many scholars have, over the centuries wondered if Paul is adapting maybe a song that the Colossians were used to singing, kind of a preformed hymn. Of course, probably added his own elements, but either way, as the letter as it stands in chapter 1, right, it's this really kind of cosmic vision of Christ as both creator and reconciler. And so we see this, again, glorious hymn that we perhaps even have memorized, where Christ is active in creating the world. He's the first act of also new creation, right? So resurrection, this kind of recreation, Christ stands at the head of that as well. And as both creator and new creation, right, Christ is also reconciling, Paul says, all things to himself. And so that all things language, I think, usurps in some ways, maybe subverts all the other ways that the Colossians are kind of caught up in these traditions about eating and drinking and celebrating Sabbaths, to say that all things kind of find their completion in Christ, and that being reconciled to him gives them that fullness of life that perhaps they're searching for. When we talk about reconciliation, of course, it's easy maybe for some of us to talk about reconciliation to God, that God reconciles us to himself through Christ. But one of the interesting things in Colossians is that it's also aimed at the reconciliation of the community amongst itself. So Paul says, if you're reconciled to Christ, we are reconciled to one another. This human reconciliation is part of that entire package that Christ is doing.
So, am I right in thinking if Jesus is the creator, the one who kind of encompasses all things in some ways, or is in all things, like Paul talks about, then that means that we're all kind of headed roughly towards the same goal. So the things that are separating us don't need to, because everything is finding its home, its goal in Jesus.
Yeah, that's his main point. That as kind of harbingers of the new creation, these communities that Paul is helping launch, develop, sustain, right? They become these kind of outposts of the kingdom. And so that reconciliation, although we tend to think of that sometimes as a future element, right? That God will reconcile all things someday in the future. The early Christians, right, believe that had started now. And that they could have a foretaste of that in the present. And so that actually is what makes our worship together each week actually rather surprising and rather important, is that we become this kind of foretaste of what the world will one day be. And so as we think about reconciliation, our relationships with one another are of utmost importance, because they become a sign for the world of how human relationships will one day be. So rather than being kind of racked with division and angst and maybe animosity towards one another, they become relationships of peace, forgiveness, and unity as a sign of that ultimate restoration.
That seems like a very high calling for the church. And I wonder, obviously the church today is facing a lot of issues and divisions and things like that. What would you say is the kind of key message for us contemporary readers of Paul, and particularly contemporary readers of Colossians? Like what can we take away as the key message?
Yeah, I think obviously we have a lot of challenges facing us today as a church, both here in the States and of course in the UK and in Europe. I think that's one of the places, if we understand Paul's kind of theology of the Spirit, is that the Spirit is the game changer. It is the sign that God has, said yes to his promises. This is the Spirit that was promised by Joel and the prophets. So we can experience that now. And it's a creative act of power, right? So the Spirit, that third person of the Trinity, is what raises Christ from the dead. And so I think, as we look around at our world and at issues that kind of beset the church, and oftentimes we can get discouraged, we have the same power at work both in us that not only raised Christ from the dead, but also empowered the early church. And if Paul teaches us anything, it's that God's power, however we think of that, is displayed in weakness. And so I think as we look at our challenges, they really are opportunities for a great work of God, where, to quote a friend, right, unless God sustains it, it'll fail. And so I think, as we look at these things that kind of beset the church, we can rest in the fact of Paul's vision of Christ, that he is seated at the right hand of the Father, and he is actively reconciling kind of all things to himself. And that ought to be, I think, a message of hope, especially in a world where it's so easy to get discouraged.
That certainly gives me hope, and it sounds like you find hope and comfort in that as well.
Yeah, certainly. And it doesn't, I think, relieve us of the hard work that has to be done, kind of on the ground. But knowing that we are not, I think, charting new territory, but rather the Spirit goes ahead of us, kind of breaking that ground. And we are really, as we see in the book of Acts, just trying to keep up with the work that the Spirit is doing. And I think that, as others have mentioned, is what we call the discipline of hope, is that we constantly remind ourselves week in and week out, both in worship and at the table, that this is kind of the true reality that kind of resets all things. And so I think as we see God's work, that God has not abandoned his creation. I think that's one of the other elements we see in Colossians, is that when we think about God's reconciliation, it's us and God, us and one another, but it's also us and the world, both the physical world, and that we are kind of all in this together, as it were, in God's great act of reconciliation.
I love that. A discipline of hope. That's really good. Hey, Jason, I want to thank you so much for giving up a small chunk of your time today and chatting through some of these.
You're most welcome.
Things. When are you hoping to have the commentary done by? Is this going to be a few years worth of work, or
That is the great question. Hopefully in the next year or two, we'll have it wrapped up. It's supposed to be a shorter one, as most commentaries at least start out, but they tend to grow. Hopefully in the next couple of years, it'll be out and it'll be available for others to read and hopefully learn and grow from.
Excellent. Well, I really look forward to seeing that. And you're going to be over in the UK doing some teaching next year, and hopefully, I'm not going to hold you to it, or maybe I will hold you to it. We'll hope to see you down here in Hastings as well at some point in that time. So
yeah, I'm hoping to be over there. I'll be over there in September and January, and I think I would love to come down in January and hang out and meet some people and continue learning and teaching about the Bible.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll speak to you soon. Cheers.
Thank you.